The final candle in the great archive has been lit. The dust of 1,000 years brushed softly away. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. Let your breath slow and follow the ancient ink glowing in the firelight. Here, in this deepest chamber of the library, the shelves climb higher than the eye can comfortably follow, each row sagging gently under the comfortable weight of rolled papyrus and leather-bound tomes, their spines soft with age, their pages exhaling the faintest breath of cedar oil and dried lavender. The lamp beside me casts a warm, amber circle on the reading table, and beyond that circle, the rest of the archive fades into a comfortable, velvety dark. The stones of the walls are thick and cool, and they hold the silence in the way old stones do, like cupped hands around still water. Outside, somewhere far beyond these walls, the world turns and rustles and murmurs. But that world is very far away now. There is only this gentle amber glow, this quiet, and the old, patient words waiting on the page before me. Tonight, dear resting traveller, the scroll I have unrolled for you is among the most ancient and most beautiful in all the collection. It concerns a question that has lulled philosophers and wanderers to rest for over 2,000 years. A question as soft and persistent as starlight. The question is this: is the universe singing? Does the great turning sky above us, with all its wandering lights and wheeling constellations, produce a music so vast, so constant, so deeply woven into the fabric of everything, that we have simply forgotten how to hear it? Settle deeper now. Let the chair hold you. Let the warmth of this room find your shoulders and your hands. The story begins, as so many great stories do, in the long ago quiet of ancient Greece, on an island surrounded by the soft, dark Aegean Sea, with a man who listened very, very carefully to the world around him. His name was Pythagoras, and he was born on the island of Samos, around 570 years before the Common Era. He was a man who believed, with a certainty as calm and immovable as bedrock, that the universe had a hidden architecture, and that this architecture was not built from stone or timber or clay, but from something far more delicate and far more enduring. It was built from number, from ratio, from proportion. He believed, in his quiet and methodical way, that if one could only learn to read the numerical patterns beneath the surface of ordinary things, one would find that the world was not chaotic or random or frightening at all. It was ordered. It was harmonious. It was, in the deepest sense of that word, beautiful. The story most often told about Pythagoras, the one that has drifted down through the centuries like a leaf on a slow current, is the story of the smithy. Picture it, not as something urgent or loud, but as a memory softened by time, the edges rounded like river stones. Pythagoras is walking through the winding streets of a harbour town, and somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's forge is at work. The sound of hammers on iron drifts out through an open doorway, and something in that sound catches his attention. The way a particular quality of evening light sometimes catches the eye. He pauses, he listens, and he notices that the hammers, though they all strike the same anvil, do not all produce the same sound. Some ring high, some ring low. Some, struck together, produce a sound that is pleasing in a way that seems to go beyond mere preference, a consonance that feels almost inevitable, like two rivers joining and becoming one wide, peaceful flow. Pythagoras, according to the legend, investigated the hammers and found that their weights fell into simple ratios with one another. The heaviest and the lightest formed a 2-to-1 proportion, and together they produced what we would now call a perfect octave. A 12-to-8 proportion gave a perfect fifth. A 12-to-9 proportion gave a perfect fourth. The mathematics and the music were, it seemed, the same thing seen from different directions, and that realization settled into Pythagoras the way dusk settles over a wide, flat plain, quietly, completely, without dramatic announcement, until the whole landscape is transformed. He went home and he experimented. He stretched strings of different lengths across a simple wooden frame, a device the ancient world called a monochord, meaning single string. He plucked the full length and listened. Then he pressed his finger to the midpoint and plucked again. And the note that sounded was the same note but higher, lighter, lifted one complete octave above. The string at half its length sang twice the pitch. 2-to-1. The same ratio he had found in the smithy, reappearing here in a vibrating thread, bright and clear and exact. He shortened the string to 2/3 of its length, and the interval of a fifth rang out, pure and open and settling, the way a long-held breath finally released is settling. He tried 3/4 of the length, and a fourth appeared, a sound that seems to lean gently forward, expectant and warm. The intervals that the human ear finds most naturally consonant, most instinctively restful, were the intervals produced by the simplest whole number ratios. 1-to-2, 2-to-3, 3-to-4. Pythagoras held this discovery the way one holds something unexpectedly warm found in cold water. And then, slowly, his thoughts began to drift upward from the vibrating string on his table to the vast, turning spheres of the night sky above. If number governs what is harmonious here on earth, his reasoning went, quietly and inevitably, then number must also govern what is harmonious in the heavens. For the Pythagoreans, this was not a speculative leap. It was a logical consequence. The universe, in their understanding, was a unified whole, and the same laws that structured the small structured the large. And so, gazing at the moon and the sun and the 5 wandering planets that ancient astronomers had traced across the sky, they drew a conclusion that is, when you consider it slowly in a quiet place like this, of almost unbearable poetic beauty. Each celestial body, they reasoned, moves through the heavens at its own particular speed. And just as the speed of a vibrating string, the number of times it oscillates each moment, determines the pitch it produces, so too the speed of each planet through the sky determines a kind of pitch, a tone, a note belonging only to it. And because the distances between the planetary spheres mirrored the ratios of musical consonants, the notes they produced did not clash and collide into noise. They blended, they harmonized. The moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the great fixed sphere of stars beyond them all, each turning at its own ordained velocity, each singing its own deep and continuous note, and together producing something that the ancient world called the musica universalis, the music of the spheres. A symphony so vast and so constant that it encompassed everything. A sound that was not heard with ears, but felt through the bones of the world itself, present in every heartbeat and every tide and every season's patient return. The Pythagorean brotherhood who gathered around this teaching lived with it not merely as an intellectual idea, but as a way of life. They understood the human being as a small echo of the cosmic order, a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, an instrument that could be tuned or detuned by the sounds and experiences it encountered. This was not a casual metaphor. They believed it with the earnest literalness of people who have seen, in a simple vibrating string, proof that the universe is held together by invisible mathematics. And so they used music as medicine. Each morning, before the full light of day had come, they would gather and sing hymns whose intervals were chosen to awaken the mind gently, to align its inner proportions with the proportions of the turning heavens. And each evening, as the light softened and faded, they would sing different songs, slower, deeper, built from intervals that soothed rather than stimulated, that guided the restless thoughts back into stillness and prepared the soul for the healing quiet of sleep. Morning music to awaken, evening music to ease down. The same principle that governed the movement of the stars above was applied, with care and intention, to the rhythms of the human day. The great curriculum of the ancient world, which came to be called the quadrivium, placed music at its heart, alongside arithmetic and geometry and astronomy, not as entertainment or ornament, but as a fundamental key to understanding the structure of all things. To study music in the Pythagorean tradition was to study the laws of the universe from the inside, to feel them in the body before the mind had words for them. Picture now, if you will, the evening gatherings of those ancient students in whatever modest hall or courtyard they inhabited, the sky above them growing deep and dark, the first stars emerging one by one from the fading blue, each one taking its place in the great, silent, turning pattern overhead. The students sitting in the warm darkness, listening to the long, slow notes of their teacher's instruments, feeling something unknowable in those sounds, something that seemed to reach past the ears into a quieter room in the self, a room where thought settles like sediment in still water, where breath slows without effort, where the boundary between the particular person and the enormous night around them becomes soft and a little uncertain. The philosophy did not stop with Pythagoras. It found its way through the long, unhurried drift of generations into the writings and dialogues of Plato, who was born a little over a century after Pythagoras, and who took the Pythagorean intuition and wove it into something vast and formal and enduring. In one of his later and most intricate dialogues, the Timaeus, Plato described the creation of the universe itself as a musical act. The creator he imagined, a craftsman he called the demiurge, did not make the universe from nothing. He found a formless, pre-existing chaos, and he brought order to it, not with hammers or fires, but with ratios. He divided the substance of the world soul, the animating principle of the cosmos, into proportions that corresponded to the harmonic intervals of the musical scale. The octave, the fifth, the fourth, these were not merely pleasant sounds that humanity had discovered on strings. They were the structural ratios woven into the fabric of existence at the moment of creation. Physical reality was, at its deepest level, a downstream expression of these harmonic proportions, the way ripples on water are a downstream expression of a stone dropped somewhere out of sight. And then, in his great work, The Republic, Plato closed the dialogue with a story that has drifted through the centuries like a dream half remembered at the edge of waking. He called it the myth of It tells of a soldier who falls in battle and finds himself in some state between life and death, looking at the true architecture of the cosmos. He sees the universe arranged as 8 great concentric spheres, nested within each other like the rings of a tree, made immense and luminous, each sphere carrying one of the celestial bodies on its rim. And on each sphere, at its outermost edge, there stands a figure, a siren, carried in endless revolution by the turning of her sphere. As she turns, she sings a single sustained note, her particular and unvarying tone ringing out into the enormous dark. 8 spheres, 8 sirens, 8 notes, different in pitch and depth and character, and yet, together, they form one single, perfect, transcendent chord. Not a sound that overwhelms or startles, a sound that simply is, fundamental and constant, the way the warmth of summer is constant, or the sound of one's own heartbeat, present, always and everywhere. Noticed only in the rare moments of sufficient stillness, Plato's sirens have been singing for a very long time. Their song has drifted through 24 centuries of human thought, surfacing in poetry and mathematics and cathedrals and computations, changing its form, but not its essential nature. The universe is ordered. The universe is harmonic. The universe is, in some sense that escapes simple language, singing. And here in this library, where the candles burn low and the night settles around the old stones like deep, comfortable water, that song feels very close. Not loud, not urgent, just present, the way the breathing of a sleeping house is present, quiet and continuous, and profoundly reassuring. Let your own breathing slow a little more now. Let the amber light on the ceiling blur gently at the edges. The spheres are turning above us as they always have in their vast and patient circles. And whatever note they carry, it is one that has been sounding since before any human ear existed to not quite hear it. There is a comfort in that continuity, in knowing that the turning has been going on and will go on, steady and indifferent to urgency, indifferent to worry, indifferent to anything but the quiet mathematics of its own immense and harmonious order. The night is very still now. The parchment rustles softly as I turn the page, and the sound of it, that dry and gentle whisper, dissolves into the warm dark of the archive. Rest here for a moment. Let this first story settle into you like the warmth of a familiar room. There is more to tell, more chapters in this long and drifting account, more philosophers and astronomers and poets who heard the music and tried to write it down. But all of that can wait, quietly and patiently, for whenever you are ready to continue. The archive is just as you left it, the amber lamp still burning at the same gentle angle, casting its patient circle of gold across the table and the open pages before me. The silence here is the particular silence of very old places, not empty, but full, filled with the accumulated quiet of centuries. The way a deep well is full of a darkness that is not absence, but presence, something cool and still and waiting. The dust motes that drifted through the lamplight earlier have settled now onto the shelves, onto the spines of the scrolls, onto the folds of my robe, coming to rest as dust motes always do, slowly, without hurry, without any destination other than stillness itself. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. Breathe in the warmth of old cedar and dried ink. Let the weight of the chair receive you. There is nowhere to arrive. The story continues at whatever pace the candlelight requires. And the candlelight tonight is in no hurry at all. When last we sat together in this golden dark, the harmony of the spheres was still new still glowing with the fresh conviction of Pythagoras and his brotherhood, still shining with the mathematical beauty that Plato had wrapped around it like cloth of gold. The 8 sirens of the Republic were turning on their cosmic spheres, each singing her single, perfect, sustained note into the vast and ancient night, and together their voices formed a chord so immense and so constant that no human ear had ever managed to perceive it. It was, of course, precisely that last detail, the human ear's persistent failure to hear this supposed cosmic symphony, that a younger philosopher, inheriting the great debates of his age, found impossible to leave unexamined. His name was Aristotle. He had been Plato's student, had sat in the groves of the academy and absorbed that tradition the way young minds absorb things they later feel compelled to overturn. By the time he turned his considerable analytical attention to the harmony of the spheres, he had developed a habit of thought that was precise, empirical, and gently but persistently skeptical of beauty for beauty's own sake. He wrote about the subject in his treatise on the heavens, De Caelo, and what he wrote there was, in its way, the sound of a very large and carefully placed stone dropping into the centre of a very still pool. He asked the question that was always waiting, patient and inevitable, at the edge of the doctrine. If the planets are truly producing a sound of such colossal magnitude, generated by bodies of such unimaginable size, moving at such extraordinary velocity, why does no human being hear it? Why does the world not shudder and crack under its force? Why do the birds go on singing in ordinary tones, and why does the wind still move through the olive trees with nothing behind it but itself? The Pythagorean answer to this objection had been ready for some time. Its logic was, in its way, rather elegant. A person who grows up beside a river, they argued, eventually ceases to hear the river. A coppersmith who has worked for decades in a workshop filled with the clang and ring of hammered metal eventually loses the capacity to distinguish that sound as sound at all. It becomes background. It becomes simply the texture of the world. And so with the music of the spheres. Human beings are bathed in this celestial harmony from the very first moment of existence, from before birth even, while still forming in the quiet dark of the womb, surrounded by a sound so fundamental, so omnipresent, so woven into the nature of everything, that it cannot be isolated or perceived as a separate phenomenon. We are too deep inside it to hear it. The fish does not notice the water. Aristotle considered this argument and found it insufficient, not because it lacked a certain poetic plausibility, but because it failed on physical grounds. Sound, he noted with characteristic precision, is not merely a subjective experience of the ear. It is energy, real and transferable. It exerts force on the physical world. Thunder, that modest and terrestrial instance of acoustic power, can split rocks. The sound of the spheres, if it were real, if it were truly generated by the orbital mechanics of bodies the size of planets and stars moving at cosmic velocities, would not merely fill the air with a tone that our habituation had rendered inaudible. It would shatter stone. It would tear the earth apart. It would have dismantled all terrestrial matter long before any living creature arose to not hear it. The music of the spheres, taken literally, would not soothe the world. It would obliterate it. And so Aristotle turned his attention not to the acoustics of the problem, but to its mechanics, and proposed, in place of the Pythagorean humming spheres, a system that would govern cosmological thought for the better part of 2,000 years. He described the heavenly bodies as embedded, permanently and seamlessly, in a series of transparent crystalline spheres, nested one within another, each sphere contiguous with the next, so that the whole system moved as a unified and frictionless mechanism. And because the spheres moved without friction, because they turned in a medium finer than air, a luminous and perfect substance that the ancients called ether, they produced no sound at all. The heavens, in Aristotle's vision, were not silent because their music was too vast for human ears. They were silent because silence was the correct and necessary condition of perfect, eternal, frictionless motion. For Aristotle, the music had never existed. The heavens were beautiful and orderly and mathematical, but they were, in the end, profoundly, essentially quiet. Picture the effect of this argument as it drifted slowly through the ancient world. Not a sudden refutation, not a dramatic silencing, but a slow settling, the way winter arrives in a temperate place, not all at once, but degree by degree, each morning a little cooler than the last, each evening a little more dim, until one day the traveler looks up and realizes that the warmth they had been counting on is gone, replaced by something harder and cleaner, and in its own way rather beautiful, but cold. And yet the music did not disappear. It is the nature of beautiful ideas that they do not disappear when they are refuted. They go underground. They find new forms. They wait, patient as seeds in winter earth, for a different kind of spring. The philosophers of late antiquity, those thinkers of the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, who gathered under the broad and shimmering canopy of the Neoplatonic tradition, were not willing to surrender the harmony of the spheres simply because Aristotle had demonstrated that it could not be literally heard. They responded to his argument not by abandoning the doctrine, but by relocating it, moving it gently but firmly from the physical realm into the spiritual one, from the register of the ear into the register of something they considered far more reliable and far more real. Philosophers such as Iamblichus and Proclus and Simplicius, names that have rested undisturbed in the deeper shelves of this library for many centuries, developed between them a sophisticated and rather remarkable account of why the cosmic music was real but imperceptible to ordinary human faculties. Their explanation rested on a concept they called the astral vehicle, the subtle and luminous body in which the immortal soul resides before its descent into physical incarnation. Imagine it as something like a very fine cloth, woven from a material more delicate and more responsive than anything in the gross material world. A garment of light, sensitive to vibrations that dense physical matter cannot register at all. In their understanding, the soul descends into the material world through the successive spheres of the planets, and, as it passes through each sphere, it acquires from that sphere certain qualities and tendencies. The way a traveller, passing through different landscapes, acquires in their clothes and their hair and their skin something of the particular smell and texture of each place they have moved through. But along with those qualities, the descending soul also accumulates material impurities, dense accretions that weigh down and dull the astral vehicle, clouding its sensitivity the way sediment clouds clear water, until, by the time the soul has arrived in its physical body and opened its eyes in the material world, its capacity for direct spiritual perception has been almost entirely muffled. The astral vehicle is still there, still present, still in some infinitely faint way responsive to the cosmic frequencies surrounding it, but the mud of materiality is too thick. The celestial music continues to sound. Humanity simply can no longer hear it. In this framework, Pythagoras was no longer merely a clever mathematician who had noticed something interesting about hammers and strings. He was reimagined as an exceptional and semi-divine being, one whose astral vehicle was uniquely pure, uncorrupted, polished clear by some grace or discipline or ancient virtue that ordinary human beings did not share. He could hear the music of the spheres directly, not as a metaphor or a theoretical construct, but as a literal and immediate auditory experience, as real to him as birdsong to an ordinary person. And knowing that he was exceptional in this regard, that most people would never be able to access that direct experience, he composed terrestrial music as a kind of translation, an imperfect but functional image of the cosmic harmonies, a set of sounds that, while they could not reproduce the original in its full metaphysical reality, could nonetheless carry some of its proportional structure into the physical realm, allowing those who listened to benefit from a harmony they could not directly perceive. This was a beautiful accommodation. It preserved the doctrine's spiritual power, while gracefully conceding to Aristotle's physical objections. The music of the spheres was real. It simply required a different kind of listening than the ear could provide. The Neoplatonic synthesis drifted westward across the centuries, carried in the writings and translations that made their patient way from the Greek-speaking world into Latin and eventually into the broad, slowly cooling landscape of medieval Europe. Two figures stand in the lamplight of this transmission, close enough together that their shadows overlap on the wall of history, though they were separated by 4 centuries. The first is Cicero, that Roman statesman whose prose style was so admired that it became the gold standard for Latin eloquence for over 1,000 years. Near the end of a large political work, Cicero composed a narrative that he called The Dream of Scipio, in which the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus falls asleep and finds himself lifted into the heavens, guided by the shade of his grandfather through the architecture of the cosmos. Looking down from the high reaches of the celestial spheres, Scipio sees the earth below reduced to a small and somewhat insignificant point, and he hears, arising from all around him, a sound of overwhelming richness and power. His grandfather explains, "It is the music of the spheres, the sound produced by the varied movements and intervals of the planetary orbits, a sound that has been ringing through the cosmos since before any human civilization existed to wonder at it." 4 centuries after Cicero wrote those words, a scholar named Macrobius wrote an extensive commentary on the Dream of Scipio that ran to many volumes and preserved within it a substantial portion of the Neoplatonic cosmological tradition, the ideas of Plotinus and Porphyry and others, gathered and organized and transmitted into a form that medieval readers could access and absorb. Macrobius traced the spatial relationships of the spheres, the positions of the zodiac and the Milky Way, the proportions and distances of the planetary orbits. He enshrined the harmony of the heavens as a fundamental and unquestionable feature of the educated European world. For centuries after Macrobius, a scholar who disputed the basic principle of cosmic harmony would have seemed not merely wrong, but strangely uninformed, as though arguing against the existence of geometry. But it is the second figure in this transmission who matters most for the long, patient history of the idea. His name was Boethius, and he was born around 480 years into the Common Era, a Roman senator of ancient family, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts, who spent his life attempting to translate the Greek philosophical tradition into Latin, before that tradition was lost entirely to the encroaching uncertainties of his time. He was eventually imprisoned on charges of treason and executed, and it was in prison, waiting for a death he knew was coming, that he wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. But for the history of the music of the spheres, it is an earlier treatise on the theory of music that matters most. In that work, Boethius divided music into 3 kinds, and this threefold division was so clean and so elegant that it organized the thinking of educated Europe on the subject for the next 1,000 years. The highest kind of music, he said, was musica mundana, the music of the world, generated by the mathematical motions of the planets and the proportional relationships binding the 4 elements together. This music was not audible to physical ears. It was a conceptual and mathematical reality, the harmonious structure of the cosmos itself. Below it was musica humana, the music of the human being, the harmonizing principle that unified the soul and the body, that balanced rational thought against instinct and desire, the inner proportion that, when it was functioning correctly, produced what we experience as health and equanimity and peace. And beneath both of these, the lowest and most accessible form was musica instrumentalis, the actual audible sounds produced by instruments and voices, valuable not for themselves, but insofar as they attempted, in their imperfect and earthly way, to reflect and embody the higher harmonies they could only approximate. With this formulation, Boethius did something quietly remarkable. He gave educated medieval Europe a way to believe in the music of the spheres without requiring it to be physically audible. The music was real. It was simply real on a level that was, by its very nature, beyond the reach of ordinary perception. And the music we make with our human hands and throats is, at its best, a kind of reaching toward that reality, a gesture made across an enormous distance toward something immensely beautiful that can be approached but never quite arrived at. He noted, in a passage that has drifted down through the centuries as gently as the music it describes, that whether the celestial motions sound in the ear or not, to the understanding, they strike a note most full of harmony. Let that sentence rest here in the warm air of the archive for a moment. To the understanding, they strike a note most full of harmony. Boethius wrote those words in a prison cell, with the knowledge of his execution already settled around him, like the coming of a cold and final season. And yet the sentence is perfectly calm. It does not struggle or strain. It simply observes, with the patient clarity of a man who has looked very steadily at the structure of things and found it, beneath all the particular tragedy and noise of individual lives, essentially and deeply harmonic. The candle has burned lower now. The amber light is softer. The shadows in the corners of the archive deeper and more comfortable. The heavy silence of the old stones a little warmer, a little more enveloping. The scrolls on the shelves around us breathe their ancient, gentle breath of cedar and time. Outside, the stars are making their unhurried way across the dark sky in whatever patterns they have always traced, consistent and indifferent and beautiful. The thinking of Pythagoras, the poetry of Plato's Sirens, the physical caution of Aristotle, the spiritual rescue of the Neoplatonics, the elegant organizing grief of Boethius in his prison. All of it is here, resting quietly in these pages, settled now into the long repose of history, where all urgency has dissolved and only the shapes of things remain. The wide shapes of ideas, drifting slowly in the archive dark, like continents visible only from a great and peaceful height. There is more of the story still to come. Astronomers and painters and poets yet to meet. But that is for another turning of the candlelight, another slow and easy settling into the warm dark. For now, let these ancient voices be enough. Let their patient harmonies find whatever in you is still, and rest. The candle has been replaced while you rested. A fresh one, tall and unhurried, its flame sitting perfectly still in the windless air of the archive. A small, upright tongue of amber that neither flickers nor strains, but simply burns, steadily and without ambition, casting its familiar warm circle across the table, and the open pages, and the comfortable dark beyond. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. The smell of the library is very present tonight, that deep, composite fragrance of aged leather and dried herbs, and the particular sweetness of old paper. The smell of 1,000 patient years, all breathing together in one still room. Let your shoulders settle. Let the warmth of this place find the back of your neck and the spaces between your fingers. There is no urgency here. The archive holds its silence the way good soil holds water, deeply and without effort, giving it back slowly to whatever roots find their way down into the dark. The story tonight has travelled a long distance from where it began, from Pythagoras on his island, listening to hammers ring on iron, all the way through the crystalline spheres of Aristotle's orderly and silent cosmos, through the Neoplatonic philosophers who moved the music inward into the astral vehicle and the purified soul, and through the elegant prison cell of Boethius, where a man waiting for his death organized the music of the universe into 3 calm and enduring categories. The doctrine of the harmony of the spheres had survived, as beautiful ideas tend to survive, not by remaining unchanged, but by proving itself endlessly adaptable, endlessly capable of finding new vessels. By the time we reach the long, sun-warmed afternoons of the Italian Renaissance, the vessels it would find were altogether more vivid and more human, full of colour and argument, and the particular creative restlessness that overtakes a civilization discovering all at once how much there is still to think about. Venice in the 16th century was a city of extraordinary sensory richness, a city built in and on and around water, where the light came at every surface from unexpected angles, and the sound of music drifted from churches and palaces and the open windows of academies at all hours. It was in this environment that a Franciscan friar named Gioseffo Zarlino set to work on a project that would take the ancient mathematical dream of the Pythagoreans and refit it for the complex, many-voiced music of his own time. Zarlino was a pupil of the great maestro at St. Mark's Basilica, and he had spent years in one of the most musically sophisticated environments in Europe, surrounded by the intricate, interwoven voices of Renaissance polyphony, music that bore almost no resemblance to the simple monochord experiments of the ancient world, but that Zarlino was convinced must rest somewhere beneath its elaborate surface, on the same mathematical foundations. In his landmark treatise of 1558, the Istitutioni Harmonicae, he attempted to show exactly how. The ancient Pythagorean tuning system, he found, was beautiful in theory and somewhat uncomfortable in practice. Built entirely on pure fifths and fourths, it produced intervals that, when stacked in the complex choral textures of 16th century music, had a tendency to rasp slightly, to produce a faint harshness that offended the refined ears of contemporary listeners. The major thirds in particular, which appeared constantly in the harmonies of his time, sounded, under strict Pythagorean tuning, slightly too sharp, slightly too bright, like a color that has been turned up just a degree or two past its ideal warmth. Zarlino's response was not to abandon the mathematical framework, but to adjust it with extraordinary care, slightly tempering the pure fifths, compressing them by a tiny, calculated amount, in order to allow the thirds to settle into a sweetness that the purely rational system had not quite managed to provide. He called this approach mean-tone temperament, and it was a kind of mathematical negotiation, a gentle compromise between the ideal and the actual, between the perfect proportions of the cosmos and the imperfect but living reality of human voices singing together in a stone basilica, with a light coming through coloured glass and the smell of incense drifting through the nave. But even as he adjusted the mathematics, Zarlino held firmly to the deeper conviction. He believed, with the full weight of the Pythagorean and Neoplatonic tradition behind him, that music acted on the soul not merely as entertainment or ornament, but as a direct physical and metaphysical force. He mapped the emotional world onto the harmonic one with a specificity that would have pleased Pythagoras and delighted Boethius. Major intervals, he wrote, conveyed strength and joy and the kind of open, outward-moving energy. Minor intervals carried something more interior, more melancholy, a folding inward, a quieting. The composer who chose his intervals thoughtfully was not merely making aesthetic decisions. He was managing the proportions of the human soul with the same care that the demiurge of Plato's Timaeus had brought to the proportions of the world soul at the moment of creation. There is something comforting in that idea, approached slowly and in a quiet place like this. The music we find restful is restful because it embodies proportions that correspond at some level below the reach of language to the harmonious order of an entire cosmos. When a chord resolves, when the tension of a dissonance settles finally into consonance, what we are feeling, very faintly and through many layers of translation, is the universe demonstrating its own deep preference for order over chaos, for harmony over noise, for rest over restlessness. The Renaissance did not only think about this, it painted it. In Venice and Rome and Florence, artists grappled with the peculiar challenge of making visible something that was by definition inaudible. The publication in 1496 of a great musical treatise by the scholar Francinus Gefurius featured extraordinary woodcuts that placed the muses and the planetary spheres and the musical modes in explicit visual relationship to one another. A diagram of the musica mundana rendered in ink on paper, something you could look at and follow with a finger, the way you might trace a map of a country you had never visited but somehow already loved. In the Vatican, Raphael placed Pythagoras in the foreground of his vast fresco of the School of Athens. The philosopher bent over a tablet on which the harmonic ratios are carefully inscribed, his attention so complete and so absorbed that the entire magnificent world of Greek philosophy assembled behind him seems to exist partly for the purpose of providing a backdrop to this one quiet, calculating figure. In Venetian paintings throughout this period, the celestial spheres were populated with angels bearing lutes and rebecks, their instruments very precisely rendered, their fingers placed on strings with a specificity that suggested the painters knew exactly what they were depicting. And yet, scholars who have looked very carefully at the music visible in these paintings have found that the scores the angels hold are frequently inverted, or partially obscured, or composed of notes that form no playable sequence. This is not carelessness. It is a deliberate and rather lovely signal that the music in the painting is not meant to be played on any earthly instrument. It is symbolic. It is the idea of music, the mathematical soul of music, rendered visible as a figure of light with a stringed instrument, gesturing toward something that cannot be fully represented in any medium available to human hands. Into this richly musical and philosophical world, in the early years of the 17th century, stepped two men whose disagreement about the nature of the harmony of the spheres became one of the more fascinating intellectual disputes in the history of ideas. They were, in almost every respect, opposites, and the argument between them illuminates with unusual clarity two fundamentally different ways of trying to understand the universe. The first was Robert Fludd, an English physician, a man of considerable learning and considerable imagination, who had spent his life attempting to synthesize the full range of human knowledge. Alchemy, astrology, theology, natural philosophy, music, and Kabbalah into a single unified vision of how everything related to everything else. Flood was not a fraud or a fantasist. He was a serious thinker, working within a tradition that took the symbolic and the mystical as seriously as the empirical. A tradition that believed the universe could be read as a text, and that the reader who approached it with sufficient learning and sufficient openness would find it coherent from its smallest detail to its largest structure. In his great illustrated work, The History of the Two Worlds, published between 1617 and 1621, Flood presented the universe as a divine monochord, a single cosmic string stretched vertically from the dense, gross matter of the earth all the way up to the highest empyrean heaven, where God's hand rested at the topmost peg, tuning the string, determining by the tension of that single cosmic thread the density and harmony and material state of every level of existence below. The universe, in Flood's vision, was not merely analogous to a musical instrument. It was one. God was the musician, creation was the music, and the human being, as always in this tradition, was a microcosm, a small replica of the cosmic instrument, with the same 3 octaves present in miniature within the span from foot to crown, the physical body corresponding to the elemental realm, the vital spirit corresponding to the celestial, the immortal soul reaching toward the divine at the apex. There is something deeply restful about Flood's vision, approached from the distance of 4 centuries and the warmth of a candlelit library. It is a vision of a universe in which everything is connected to everything else by living threads of proportion and resonance, in which nothing is isolated or arbitrary, in which the smallest note struck on the smallest instrument participates in the same harmonic system as the turning of the farthest star. It is a universe that holds its inhabitants the way a piece of music holds its individual notes, each one dependent on the others for its meaning, each one part of something larger and more beautiful than itself. The second man was Johannes Kepler, and he was, in almost every respect, of a different temperament. Kepler was a German astronomer and mathematician, a contemporary of Flood's, possessed of a mind of extraordinary precision and an appetite for calculation that was, by all accounts, essentially insatiable. He had spent years working with the observational data of the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, the most accurate astronomical measurements yet made by human instruments, and he had discovered in those numbers something that shattered 2,000 years of inherited assumption. The planets, he showed, did not move in circles. They moved in ellipses, slightly flattened ovals, with the sun not at the center, but at one of 2 focal points. Perfect circular motion, that great and ancient aesthetic requirement, the shape that philosophy had insisted must belong to the perfect eternal heavens, was simply not what the numbers described. This discovery was a crisis for the traditional harmony of the spheres. If a planet moved in an ellipse, its distance from the Sun changed continuously throughout its orbit, and if its distance changed, its speed changed, following the same law that governed the vibrating string. Closer to the center meant faster, farther meant slower. A planet in elliptical orbit was therefore not producing a single constant tone the way Plato's Sirens had sung, each one her unwavering note. It was producing a continuously shifting melody, sliding upward as it swung close to the Sun at perihelion, descending again as it curved away toward aphelion, an arc of pitch tracing the arc of its path through space. Kepler did not find this distressing. He found it thrilling. In his monumental work of 1619, the Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, he calculated for each known planet the ratio between its maximum and minimum angular velocity, its fastest and slowest rates of apparent motion as seen from the Sun, and he expressed this ratio as a musical interval. The results came remarkably close to the intervals of classical harmony. Saturn, moving with the stately, unhurried gravity of the outermost visible planet, spanned a minor third. Jupiter, nearly as slow, covered a major third. Mars, with its notably elliptical orbit, rang out across a perfect fifth. And the Earth, that particular world where human beings wake each morning to whatever the day has prepared for them, the Earth oscillated between two notes separated by a semitone, a tiny, close, slightly melancholy interval. Kepler noted, with what seems like affectionate darkness, that these two notes could be rendered as the syllables mi and fa, and that mi and fa, contracted in the scholarly Latin of his time, stood for miseria and fames, misery and hunger. The Earth's song, in Kepler's calculations, was a small, repeated, almost resigned oscillation between two neighboring notes, the sound of a world that contains, as its very orbital signature, the acknowledgement of human difficulty. And yet, working through these calculations in pursuit of something that was essentially aesthetic, essentially the ancient Pythagorean dream of finding music in the mechanics of the sky, Kepler arrived, almost as a side effect of his harmonic searching, at one of the foundational laws of modern astronomy. He found that the squares of the orbital periods of any two planets are directly proportional to the cubes of their mean distances from the Sun. This is Kepler's third law, and it governs celestial mechanics as surely today as it did in 1619. It was found not by abandoning the music of the spheres, but by taking that ancient dream so seriously, following its mathematical thread so patiently and so rigorously, that the thread led somewhere its ancient makers had never imagined. The harmony of the spheres, pursued with sufficient precision, had disclosed a genuine and enduring truth about how the universe works. Kepler himself believed the music was real, though not audible in the ordinary sense. It was, he said, a music that was heard by the soul, not the ear, the soul. In this, he and Boethius were, across 11 centuries, in quiet agreement. While the astronomers and physicians of the early 17th century debated the precise mechanics of celestial harmony, The poets of the preceding centuries had already been doing something with the idea that no mathematical treatise could quite accomplish. They had been feeling it from the inside, using the music of the spheres not as a theoretical proposition, but as a living, structural metaphor for the deepest experiences of the human soul, for love and loss and the yearning for an order that the world's surface does not always reveal. Dante Alighieri completed his Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, and the third and final canticle, the Paradiso, is an ascent through the same Ptolemaic universe that had provided the framework for 2,000 years of cosmological thought. 9 concentric spheres surrounding the Earth, each one carrying its celestial body in its appointed revolution, and beyond them all, the vast, still, boundless Empyrean, where God's presence rests like the warmth at the center of everything. What Dante does with the harmony of the spheres is quietly remarkable. The pilgrim Dante, ascending from sphere to sphere in the company of his guide Beatrice, hears music at every level of heaven. The blessed souls sing as they move, the spheres themselves ring with something sweet and continuous. But Dante, in a theological move of great elegance, shifts the source of the music from the physical mechanics of the spheres to the spiritual state of the souls inhabiting them. It is not the friction or the mass or the orbital velocity that produces the celestial harmony. It is the quality of the will, a soul that has aligned itself perfectly with divine love, that has surrendered its particular individual desiring entirely to the pattern of the whole. That soul sings in perfect consonance with the cosmos, contributing its note to the chord not as an obligation, but as the natural expression of its own deepest nature. The harmony of the spheres, for Dante, is not a feature of physics. It is the acoustic signature of perfect love. He states it in a passage of great simplicity. Differing voices, he says, make sweet music. Just as differing ranks in our life create sweet harmony among these wheels. The diversity of the spheres, the diversity of the souls, the diversity of individual human beings in their historical lives, none of this diversity is a problem to be resolved. It is the very material from which harmony is made. A chord requires different notes. A cosmos requires different beings. And when those different beings are each perfectly themselves, each fully resonant with their own particular nature and their own particular place in the whole, the result is not unison, but harmony, something richer and more various and more deeply satisfying than any single tone sustained alone. 3 centuries after Dante, John Milton took the same tradition and turned it toward a different kind of grief. Milton was a man of enormous learning and enormous loss, a poet who went blind in the middle of his creative life and who watched the political project he had believed in, the great English experiment in governance without a king, collapse and reverse itself completely. He wrote Paradise Lost in the years following that collapse, dictating it from memory and imagination into the darkness around him. And what he built there was a universe in which the music of the spheres is real, is present, is singing, but has become unreachable. Before the fall, in Milton's telling, the music of the spheres was simply part of the world, as accessible and natural as sunlight. The unfallen Adam and Eve moved through a garden in which the proportions of cosmic harmony were present in every flower and every bird song and every breath of evening wind. But the fall, the disobedience, the turning of the individual will away from the pattern of the whole, introduced into creation a fundamental dissonance. The music did not stop, but it became inaudible to fallen human ears, not because of sensory habituation, as the Pythagoreans had suggested, not because of material impurities on the astral vehicle, as the Neoplatonics had argued, but because the inner ear of the soul, the faculty that could perceive celestial proportion, had been damaged by the specific damage of sin. Milton called this human exile from the music of the spheres the harsh din that afflicts the fallen world, and he set it against the memory of a lost concord, with a longing so precise and so sustained that it becomes, in his poetry, almost a physical sensation, the feeling of reaching for something that was once, in some older and better time, simply there. But Milton is not despairing. He ends the ode at a solemn music written in his younger years with the possibility of restoration, the hope that the long work of spiritual redemption might one day allow human voices to join again in the song that has never stopped being sung, to come back into tune with the harmony that the fallen world has made inaudible, but has never, not for a moment, interrupted. The candle burns lower now, its flame still perfectly steady, still casting the same warm circle. But the circle has grown somehow softer at the edges, the shadows in the room a little deeper and more comfortable than they were when we began. The heavy stones of the archive walls absorb the silence and give it back, thickened, enriched, the way old wood absorbs the music played in a room over many years and gives it back as a warmth in the air that has no specific source. The Renaissance painters with their angels and their painted scores, Zarlino in his Venetian study adjusting the perfect ratios to accommodate the sweet imperfection of human voices, Flood with his divine monochord and God's hand at the highest peg, Kepler in his study surrounded by orbital calculations that somehow kept resolving into musical intervals, Dante ascending through the singing spheres toward a light too bright to look at directly, Milton reaching in his blindness toward a harmony he could feel the shape of but no longer quite touch. All of them rest now in these pages, in this warm dark, in this archive where the urgency of their arguments has long since dissolved into the larger quiet. The questions they were asking are still here, still open, still as patient as they ever were. But the asking is very gentle now, more like breathing than like speech, more like the barely audible sound of a distant sea than like anything that requires a response. Let the warmth of the room settle around you like a cloak. Let the amber light go soft behind your closed eyes. There is one more chapter still to come, more recent, more surprising in some ways than anything that has preceded it. A chapter in which the ancient Pythagorean dream finds its way into a telescope's data and a computer's translation, into the orbital mechanics of a distant star's 7 worlds. But that chapter is for a waiter, when the candlelight has shifted just a little more toward dark. The archive is very still tonight, stiller than usual, as though the old stones themselves have settled a little deeper into the earth beneath them, finding a more comfortable rest after the long wait of centuries. The candle flame stands perfectly upright, a thin and golden needle of light in the windless air, and its reflection in the dark surface of the reading table below it is another flame, softer and more wavering, a ghost of warmth in the polished wood. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. Let your breath move slowly, without effort or intention. Let the warmth of this last chapter find you where you are, already drifting, already more than halfway into the gentle dark. We have traveled a long way together through these pages. We began on a sun-warmed island in the ancient Aegean, with a philosopher pausing in a harbour street to listen to the sound of hammers. And we have moved through centuries and libraries and disputations and prison cells and cathedrals and Venetian canals and the blinded study of a great English poet. The idea at the centre of all of this travelling has remained, through all its transformations, essentially the same: that the universe is ordered, that its order has the structure of proportion, of ratio, of the relationship between numbers so simple that a child could state them. That this structure, when it reaches human perception, is experienced as music, as harmony, as the particular quality of rightness that settles into the body when a chord resolves and the tension that preceded it softens away into consonance. What remains to be told is the last and perhaps the most surprising chapter of this story. It takes place not in a library or a monastery or a Renaissance studiolo, but in the clean, precise environments of modern observatories and university computing centres, among astrophysicists and data scientists and programmers. People who would not necessarily describe themselves as inheritors of the Pythagorean tradition, but who have arrived through the rigorous application of mathematics to the behaviour of distant worlds, at conclusions that the ancient brotherhood of Samos would have recognised immediately, and perhaps received with a quiet, unsurprised smile. In the early months of 2017, astronomers working with data gathered by various observational instruments announced the discovery of a remarkable system located 38.5 light-years from our own Sun in the direction of the constellation Aquarius. The star at the centre of this system is small and dim and very cool, a type of star called an ultra-cool red dwarf, burning with a reddish glow so much fainter than our own Sun that its habitable zone, the region where liquid water could exist on a planet's surface, lies very close to the star itself. The star is called TRAPPIST-1, and around it, in tight and intricate orbits, 7 worlds circle. 7 Earth-sized planets, each one roughly terrestrial in composition, 3 of them lying within that narrow band of warmth where water can remain liquid, and where, in principle, chemistry of the kind that produces life might have something to work with. When the discovery was announced, it was celebrated as one of the most extraordinary finds in the history of planetary science. 7 worlds around a single, small star. 3 of them potentially habitable. It was the kind of discovery that briefly makes the universe feel more generous, more various, more full of possibility than the ordinary run of evidence tends to suggest. But the system immediately presented astrophysicists with a significant puzzle. 7 planets packed that tightly around their star should not, by the ordinary rules of orbital mechanics, be stable. Computer simulations of the system's dynamics were run repeatedly, and they consistently produced the same troubling result. The gravitational interactions between the 7 closely spaced worlds should have rendered the system violently unstable within a timescale of far less than 1,000,000 years. The planets tugging at one another's orbits with a rhythmic persistence that would eventually amplify into catastrophe, disrupting the careful paths until two worlds collided, or one was flung out of the system entirely into the cold, interstellar dark. And yet, TRAPPIST-1 is billions of years old. The system is demonstrably ancient. Whatever should have destroyed it by the mathematics of ordinary gravitational interaction has not destroyed it. The seven worlds continue their patient circuits around their dim red sun as though they have been doing so forever, which, in practical terms, they more or less have. The resolution of this paradox came gradually, as researchers examined the orbital periods of the seven planets with increasing precision, looking for whatever hidden mechanism was holding this improbable system together. And what they found, embedded in the ratios of those orbital periods, the times each planet takes to complete one circuit of its star, was something that would have been immediately familiar to anyone who had spent time with the proportions of a vibrating string. The planets of TRAPPIST-1 are locked together in what astrophysicists call a resonant chain. Orbital resonance, in the language of modern celestial mechanics, occurs when the orbital periods of two or more bodies form a simple ratio of whole numbers, so that their gravitational interactions fall into a predictable and repeating pattern, rather than accumulating in the chaotic, amplifying way that leads to instability. When two planets are in resonance, their gravitational tugs on each other occur at the same relative points in each orbit every time, so that instead of building toward disruption, the forces cancel and balance and maintain the existing configuration. The planets are, in a sense, keeping each other in place, each one's motion synchronized with the other's in a pattern of mutual support, expressed entirely in the language of mathematical proportion. In our own solar system, Neptune and Pluto maintain a 3-to-2 resonance, Neptune completing exactly 3 orbits for every 2 of Pluto's, a relationship that ensures the two bodies, despite crossing paths, never actually meet. But in TRAPPIST-1, this principle operates across all 7 worlds simultaneously, in a chain of interlocking resonances of exceptional mathematical elegance. The innermost pair of planets completes their orbital ratios in proportions corresponding to 8-to-5. Moving outward, the next pair resonates at 5-to-3, then 3-to-2, then 2-to-1 at several consecutive pairings, each relationship a simple fraction, a small whole number divided by another small whole number, the same class of ratios that Pythagoras had discovered in the weights of blacksmith's hammers and the lengths of vibrating strings, 25 centuries before anyone had a telescope pointed at a dim red star in Aquarius. Astrophysicists and musicians, working together with the delight of people who have found an unexpected door between two rooms they thought were separate, converted these orbital frequencies into sound. They assigned the outermost planet a baseline frequency corresponding to the musical note C, then scaled the inner planets proportionately according to their resonant ratios. When the resulting tones were played together, the 7 worlds of TRAPPIST-1 rang out as a chord. Not a random cluster of frequencies, not an accident of numerical coincidence, but a recognizable, musical, resonant chord, a C major 9 with a slightly sharp quality, complex and rich, the kind of chord that seems to contain within it both tension and resolution simultaneously, that seems to lean gently forward into the next moment while remaining fully present in this one. 2.5 millennia after Pythagoras theorized that the solar system was held together by the same proportional laws that governed a vibrating string, modern observational astronomy had confirmed that resonant harmonic ratios are the literal, physical mechanism preventing at least one distant planetary system from tearing itself apart. The music of the spheres, it turns out, is not merely a beautiful metaphor for cosmic order. In a very specific and measurable sense, for the 7 worlds of TRAPPIST-1, it is the thing that keeps them alive. Picture this for a moment, slowly and without urgency. 7 worlds circling a small red sun 38 light-years away, each one carrying in its orbital period a simple ratio, a fraction, a proportion, and all 7 proportions interlocking into a chain of resonances that is held steady for billions of years through the patient turnings of geological epochs and the long, patient accumulation of whatever chemistry those worlds have managed in their dim, red-lit warmth. 7 notes sounding together in a chord that no human ear has ever heard, and that nonetheless exists as precisely and as really as anything else that has ever been measured out there in the ancient dark between the stars. Pythagoras would have found this satisfying. Plato's demiurge would have recognized the proportions. Boethius, in his prison cell, would have received the news with a calm that was perhaps the deepest form of vindication. And the story does not stop even there. Because the universe is full of information that is not visible, that does not reach us as light, but as data, as numbers collected by instruments of extraordinary sensitivity, translated into digital records, and stored in the computing archives of the great observatories. X-rays from ancient stellar explosions, infrared light from the warm nurseries where new stars are forming in slow spirals of gas and dust, the faint electromagnetic signatures of phenomena so distant and so energetic that the human mind cannot hold their scales. None of this reaches the eye. None of it, in its raw form, reaches any human sense at all. But it can be translated. It can be mapped onto the registers of sound, the frequencies that human hearing can access, in a process that scientists call data sonification. The process is rigorous and precise. Brightness corresponds to volume. Distance from the center of an image corresponds to pitch. Objects detected by different instruments, visible light and X-rays and infrared, are assigned different timbres, so that the listener can distinguish their contributions the way a trained ear distinguishes the violin from the cello in a string quartet. The result is not arbitrary or aesthetic in origin. It is a faithful translation, each audible element corresponding to a measured quantity in the original data, the music generated by the numbers themselves. And the sounds that emerge from this process are, by the accounts of those who have listened to them, often beautiful. The sonification of a binary star system, a white dwarf and a red giant, in their slow, gravitationally bound dance, produces something that listeners describe as haunting, layered, complex, the 2 stars tracing their relationship in overlapping tones that swell and fade as the brightness of each fluctuates and their positions shift in the slow choreography of their shared orbit. The sonification of a vast cloud of gas where new stars are forming produces something more ambient, more continuous, a wash of sound in which individual notes emerge and recede, like details in a landscape seen from a moving vehicle. Each object has its own acoustic character, its own way of being translated, its own contribution to what NASA's researchers have called, without evident irony, cosmic harmonies. The utility of this practice reaches beyond the aesthetic. It makes the data accessible to people who cannot see, ensuring that the exploration of the cosmos is not limited by the particular set of senses one happens to possess. And it exploits something remarkable about the human brain, the extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition in sound, the ability to notice a change in pitch or rhythm or timbre that might remain invisible in a dense graph of numerical data, that might slip past the eye unremarked, but that the ear would catch immediately. We evolved to listen to complex, layered, changing soundscapes, to hear the difference between the wind in ordinary leaves and the wind in leaves that something is moving through. And this deep evolutionary capacity for auditory pattern detection is now being applied to the light curves of distant stars, to the plasma resonances of the Earth's own magnetosphere, to the electromagnetic signatures of phenomena that would have been entirely invisible to every human being who has ever lived until now. Pythagoras, listening to the harmonics of his monochord on his island in the Aegean, could not have imagined a radio telescope or an X-ray observatory or a digital computing array capable of translating stellar data into sound. But he would have recognized immediately what the scientists are doing. He would have recognized the impulse, the conviction that the universe is ordered and that its order can be perceived if one only finds the right method of listening. He would have recognized the patience required, the long, meticulous accumulation of data, the careful translation of one register of reality into another. He would have recognized the delight of finding in the numbers something that the human ear can receive and the human soul can respond to. The great arc of this story, from the smithy in Samos to the Trappist one system in Aquarius, from the monochord to the radio telescope, from the harmonics of a vibrating string to the orbital resonances of 7 distant worlds, is not the story of an idea that was once beautiful and then proved wrong. It is the story of an intuition so fundamental and so correct in its deepest structure that it has survived every revision, every refutation, every reformation, because the revision and the refutation and the reformation each time confirmed, in new language and with new precision, the thing the intuition had been pointing at from the very beginning. The universe has a mathematical structure. That structure has the properties of harmonic proportion, and when that proportion is translated into the register of human hearing, it produces something that resonates in the body and the soul as music. The stars are doing this now, outside these walls, in the wide dark above the library's roof. The planets of our own system are moving in their orbits, each one maintaining its proportional relationship to the others, each one participating in the gravitational conversation that has been going on since before the Earth had a solid surface to stand on. 38 light years away, 7 worlds are turning around their small red sun, their orbital periods locked in their ancient chain of resonances, the chord of their existence ringing in silence through the empty dark between us and them. And at observatories on mountains and in orbit above the atmosphere, instruments are gathering the light and the data of phenomena more distant still, translating what they find into numbers that will eventually, patiently be turned into sound. The music of the spheres is not an archaic myth. It is not a comforting falsehood that science has kindly allowed to persist for sentimental reasons. It is an ancient name for something real, something that has been demonstrably and measurably present in the structure of the cosmos all along, waiting only for the right instruments and the right mathematics to make it legible. The Pythagoreans heard it in the proportions of a string. Plato's Sirens sang it from the rims of the turning spheres. Kepler calculated it in the elliptical velocities of the planets. And now, in the clean, precise language of orbital resonance and data sonification, the universe goes on demonstrating in every medium available to it that it is ordered, that it is proportional, that it is in the deepest and most literal sense that these old words can carry. Harmonious. Let that word settle into you now, slowly, the way warmth settles into cold hands held near a fire. Harmonious. The universe is harmonious. Not perfect, not silent, not without its dissonances and its difficult intervals and its momentary departures from the pattern, but harmonious in the deep sense, in the sense that its structure holds, that its proportions persist, that through all the noise and change and vast complexity of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, the simple ratios are still there, still governing, still keeping the 7 worlds of a distant system from colliding in the dark, still translating into sound when the right instrument is listening. You are held tonight in that same harmonic order. Your breathing follows its own rhythm, its own ratio of intake to release. Your heartbeat persists in its patient proportion. The systems of your body are conducting their intricate, resonant chemistry in the warm dark of sleep's approach, each one tuned to the others by processes so old and so fundamental that they predate by immeasurable spans of time the first human being who ever looked up at the stars and wondered whether the sky was singing. Rest now in that deep belonging. You are not separate from the harmony. You never were. You are one of its instruments, one of its notes, one of the particular and unrepeatable frequencies that the universe is producing at this specific moment in its long and patient music. The archive grows very quiet now. The lamp has burned down to a low and amber glow, barely enough to read by, the flame smaller and steadier than before, a soft point of warmth in the surrounding dark. The great shells of scrolls and tomes breathe their slow and ancient breath. The stones of the walls hold their comfortable silence. I am closing the heavy tome before me, its cover settling with a sound like a distant, muffled bell, like the softest possible chord struck once and then allowed to fade completely. The fire is an ember now, just a glow, a warmth without light. Somewhere very far above these stones, the stars are still turning. The proportions are still holding. The chord is still sounding in the patient, unhearable register of deep space and deep time. All is well. All has always been well. Sleep now. rest. The music plays on without you needing to listen. It always has. It always will.